Honor to join you this morning to host the first hearing of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China in the 119th Congress. I am to serve as the chair of the commission. I'm very honored for that responsibility, alongside with my co-chair, Representative Chris Smith, who I understand is going to run a few minutes late today, so we're going to make sure he's here. But we wanted to get this going. I want to thank my Senate colleagues who are here. This commission has a really long history of bipartisan work, bicameral work on one of the most important relationships that we have in the United States, and that's with the Chinese government and the Chinese people. And it's an honor to serve with Congressman Smith, who's been such a champion on so many of these issues for decades. I look forward to engaging in close cooperation with Senator Merkley as well, who's also been a leading voice on so many of these issues and has led this commission with skill and passion over the past 4 years. So it's a good group, and I appreciate my colleagues who are here right now. Today's hearing comes at a pivotal moment. For 75 years, the People's Republic of China has vowed to bring Taiwan under its control. We have our own Taiwan Relations Act. We have the One China policy. However, in recent years, that pressure, not just, by the way, with regard to Taiwanese, but other people, including American citizens, has intensified and globalized, with Beijing not only targeting Taiwan across the strait, it is projecting intimidation across borders, institutions, using political transnational repression as tools of coercion among people across the globe. The title of this hearing rhymes with major legislation of mine, the Stand with Taiwan Act. That bill, which I've introduced in the last 2 Congresses and will soon be introducing again, has great bipartisan support. Senators Graham, Duckworth, and Coons are the top co-sponsors, and I would encourage strong bipartisan support with my colleagues here. And what that would do is, if there is a military invasion of Taiwan by the Communist Party and the PLA of China, this would trigger punishing comprehensive sanctions on the Chinese economy and particularly leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. Punishing economic, trade, financial, energy. We all want deterrence in the Taiwan Strait, and I think the threat of these massive sanctions might be critical in terms of deterring a cross-strait invasion of Taiwan by the PLA. We also need to deal with the here and now of Chinese coercion abroad. And again, this hearing is going to focus on the coercion of Taiwanese citizens, but I want to make sure, and I certainly will be asking questions in my Q&A with the witnesses, of repression of others, people from Hong Kong, American citizens, which is really, really, really unacceptable when that happens by the Chinese Communist Party. You know, they're good at coercing their own citizens, but they're not going to, with this Congress, be allowed to coerce Americans or those who are our allies. These threats are multifaceted. AI-generated disinformation, the extraterritorial application of PRC laws, of course, diplomatic pressure on Taiwan's allies, the public intimidation of democratically elected leaders. By the way, that's something the Chinese Communist Party would never do. They'd never stand for election themselves. They fear their own people because they know they probably wouldn't get elected if they had to stand for elections. So that makes them nervous when there's people who actually stand for elections, like we do, and go before the people. The PRC is also attempting to rewrite international norms, distorting UN General Assembly Resolution 2758, and pressuring countries to embrace Beijing's view that all necessary measures it might use to achieve unification with regard to Taiwan. Most disturbingly, The PRC has labeled Taiwan's vice president, who I know well and is a good friend of mine, and other officials as obstinate Taiwan independence diehards, threatening them with life imprisonment or worse. It has declared any Taiwanese citizen, including those living abroad, can be punished under PRC law. In a closed-door meeting earlier this year, senior CCP officials Wang Huing reportedly called for a global expansion of these intimidation tactics. According to credible reporting, Wang instructed embassies and security services, hopefully they're not doing it here in America, but they probably are, to implement, quote, proactive intimidation against so-called radical Taiwanese independence advocates worldwide, including in the United States of America. These are not abstract threats. Last year, Czech intelligence uncovered a planned, quote, kinetic operation by the PRC to intimidate then Vice President-elect B. Kim on her visit there. Again, she's a friend of mine, a great person. The PRC has also harassed international media outlets for interviewing Taiwanese leaders. Individuals around the world who criticize Beijing's Taiwan policy have been doxxed and placed under surveillance. This is transnational repression. It is a coordinated strategy to isolate Taiwan and dominate the global narrative through fear and coercion, and again, not only against Taiwanese citizens, but other citizens, including our own citizens. Every day, the CCP grows bolder and more aggressive in its threats against Taiwan, the United States, and our allies in the Indo-Pacific. We need to call that out, have open hearings like this, and push back against this transnational repression. So I want to, again, thank our witnesses. I want to thank my colleagues who are here. I'll ask, again, we're going to be waiting on Congressman Smith, but we're going to begin this hearing. I'd ask Senator Merkley, who's been a longtime champion and leader of this commission, and again, I'm very honored to serve with him, and Senator Blunt Rochester, Senator Kim as well, if he would like to make any opening statements before we call our first witness and our first panel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations on your appointment, and welcome to the members of the committee. I'm very glad to see that the CECC has been reconstituted. It's holding its first hearing. I've served as chair, as co-chair, and as a returning member, and I look forward to working with you in the months ahead on these important issues of China's transgressions against basic dignity and human rights, and there are threats that extend around the globe. Last Congress, I introduced the bipartisan Transnational Repression Policy Act to address the very threat we're addressing in this hearing, and so I really appreciate that this topic is gaining more attention. I will introduce an updated version this year, and so this hearing is quite timely. The U.S. must take concrete steps to limit the ability of authoritarian states to carry out repression and hold perpetrators accountable, including as it relates to attacks against Taiwan and the Taiwanese diaspora. It's particularly important that we establish a clear government-wide definition of transnational repression, one that recognizes it as a threat to democratic institutions and to fundamental rights. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses on the PRC's expanding use of this strategy and the broader efforts to suppress dissent abroad and how we best respond to it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Senator Merkley. And before we call our first witness, I'd ask if my Senate colleagues want to make an opening statement at all on this, or okay, great. Well, thank you for being here. Our first panel, I am honored to welcome Ms. Fan Yun, a member of the legislature of Taiwan. She will be zooming in with us, I believe, for the Democratic Progressive Party, who joins us virtually from Taiwan. MP Fan was previously an associate professor at the Department of Sociology, National Taiwan University, and served as ambassador at large of Taiwan. She holds a PhD in sociology from Yale University. We'll forgive her for that. No, that's a joke. And has been a champion of democracy for decades, participating in various pro-democracy movements in Taiwan, including the 1990 Wild Lily Students Movement and the 2014 Sunflower Movement. She is also currently serves as an advisor for Democracy Without Borders and is a member of the Interparliamentarian Alliance on China. So without further ado, hopefully we have the connection here. Virtually, we'll have MP Fawn with her testimony. You are now recognized.
Okay, Chair Senator Sullivan, Co-Chair Representative Smith, Senator Merkley, and CECC members, thank you for having me as a witness today. I would also like to thank the U.S. Congress and administration for your long-standing bipartisan support for Taiwan. Last fall, our national baseball team won the World Baseball Softball Confederation's Premier 12 Championship, but our players were not allowed to wear jerseys bearing our country's name, nor could they proclaim our country's name in public. After hitting a divisive 3-run home run, our team's captain pointed to the blank space on his jersey where Taiwan should be, celebrating the name that cannot be named. This is the reality we live with, constantly being silenced by the PRC. However, enduring such political warfare has also built up our capacity to resist. As the title of this hearing suggests, in addition to growing military threats and economic coercion, the PRC's political warfare against Taiwan has also escalated. Their tactics include manipulation of international laws, United Front work activities, espionage, infiltration, and disinformation campaigns. In terms of lawfare, the PRC has twisted the UN Resolution 2758 for political propaganda in the international arena. They not only aim to suppress Taiwan's participation in various international organizations, but also seeks to legitimize the use of force to annex Taiwan. In addition, the Taiwan has intensified its united front and infiltration efforts within Taiwan. According to our National Security Bureau, the number of spy activity indictments in 2024 was 4 times higher than in 2021, rising from 16 to 64. Targets include the military, the parliament, both the ruling party and the opposition, and civic groups. The PRC has even recruited gangsters to build an armed support network all over Taiwan. The PRC has also established united front organizations in Taiwan to invite religious groups, village chiefs, and college students on heavily subsidized trips to China. For college students, there are special programs attracting young Taiwanese to study, work, or start businesses in China. These activities aim to integrate them into China's economy and eventually come to view China's politics and culture in a positive light. After last year's elections, the 2 major opposition parties formed a majority voting bloc in Taiwan's legislative yuan. After their electoral victory, the leading opposition party, KMT's caucus leader, led 17 of its lawmakers, nearly 1/3 of the entire caucus, to visit China and meet Chinese officials. Shortly thereafter, the KMT, along with the TPP, rushed to put through a series of unconstitutional bills, prevented the national security legal amendments from proceeding to a first reading, and froze or slashed the national defense budget without proper justification. Many Taiwanese believe these actions show how pro-China forces are exploiting Taiwan's democratic mechanisms to undermine both its sovereignty and democracy. In terms of disinformation, our National Security Bureau reported that messages with China's influence increased from 1.3 million in 2023 to 2.2 million in 2024, being spread through newspapers and TV stations, as well as social media platforms such as TikTok. According to a think tank GTI, some media outlets have received direct instructions from the CCP's Taiwan Affairs Office regarding news coverage and editorial commentary. The PRC also funds Taiwanese influencers to produce content in China that align with its political agenda. What's the goal of the PRC's political warfare? Firstly, it seeks to distort the world's understanding of Taiwan, specifically by framing cross-strait conflicts as a domestic issue to isolate Taiwan. Secondly, the PRC works to erode Taiwanese people's confidence in the United States. A recent poll found that TikTok users in Taiwan are more likely to view China favorably and more likely to believe that a pro-USA government might provoke war. This is a clear sign that the disinformation is influencing TikTok users, most of whom are young people. Thirdly, by spreading false narratives, the PRC aims to make Taiwanese either lose confidence in their government or disengage from politics. Potentially, these actions can ultimately lead people to lose the motivation and willpower to defend our democracy. As to transnational repression, recently, the PRC released an investigation report claiming that Taiwan's military conducted cyber attack against China. They publicized the names of 20 Taiwanese military officers and threatened them with arrest warrants and judicial punishment. Last month, the PRC launched a first-ever large-scale disinformation to attack a DPP legislator, Puma Shen, who was advocating for a tightened national security legislation. These transnational attacks against members of the military and the government, including the planned car coalition targeting then VP-elect Shaw in Czechia, are tactics the PRC is using to intimidate Taiwanese, the cost they would have to bear if they dare to resist China. How is Taiwan countering these threats? It takes cooperation between the government and civil society. In addition to raising the national defense budget to a historical high, President Lai adopted a whole-of-society defense resilience strategy aimed at strengthening the civil defense capacity. To counter the United Front, he has proposed further national security reforms to enhance our resilience against China's United Front and infiltration tactics. To tackle disinformation, all government agencies are asked to rapidly respond to misleading information. More importantly, many NGOs have created independent fact-checking websites as well as tools that can be embedded in apps. For the cognitive warfare aiming to affect the young generation, the Ministry of Education is developing teaching materials about understanding China. It aims to teach students how to critically assess Chinese propaganda. In a highly polarized politics, the effort of the ruling government alone is insufficient. Luckily, Taiwan has a robust civil society with a strong will to defend democracy. I had the honor of serving as the chief commander of the Wild Lily student movement in 1990, calling for the democratic election of our parliament. Decades later, as a professor in 2014, I was even prouder to be part of the Sunflower Movement, witnessing the younger generations successfully opposing deeper economic integration with China. Through struggles like this, our society has built a strong democratic tradition. Even now, as I am speaking, Taiwan is in the middle of an unprecedented mass recall campaign launched by civic volunteer groups. The vote will take place this coming Saturday. 31 of the KMT's 36 elected district legislators are facing bottom-up recall because many Taiwanese believe these lawmakers have forgotten that the KMT used to be an anti-communist party. As Taiwanese, we know that our freedom did not fall from the sky. Generations of Taiwanese have fought and made sacrifices for our own democracy. We are working very hard to prevent a war from happening. However, Taiwan alone will not be enough to deter China's aggression. As you must all be aware, Taiwan's security is not only critical to the stability of the region, but also key to the global economy. Standing with Taiwan, we can work together to protect our shared value, prosperity, and the rules-based global order. Thank you all for your time and support.
Well, thank you, MP Fan, and I want to thank you for testifying today and also for your courage over many years and decades on these important issues, and we very much appreciate you participating in this important hearing. So now we are going to turn to our next panel, and we are joined by three distinguished panelists to discuss the intricacies of the PRC's multifaceted campaign against Taiwan and others. And I would like everybody to please take their position, and I'm going to introduce each of our witnesses today, starting with Rear Admiral Mike Studeman. I'd like to welcome retired Rear Admiral Mike Studeman, a former commander of the Office of Naval Intelligence. Throughout his career, Admiral Studeman has led intelligence operations at every level, from the tactical to the strategic, and supported combat operations, including Desert Storm, the Balkans, in Afghanistan. Admiral Studeman's joint assignments as a flag officer included Director of Intelligence for the nation's largest combatant command, Indo-PACOM, where I first got to meet and know Admiral Studeman when our military billets overlapped, and as the Director of Intelligence for U.S. Southern Command in Miami. He has held major command posts as a captain, including the Joint Intelligence Operations Center for U.S. Cyber Command, and Admiral Studeman now currently serves as a National Security Fellow at MITRE and is on the Board of Advisors of the National Bureau of Asian Research. Admiral, thank you for your decades of service to our country. We appreciate you being here. I also want to introduce Mr. Peter Mattis, who's president of the Jamestown Foundation. Mr. Mattis previously served as a staff director on this very commission. So welcome home, welcome back from 2019 to 2021, appointed by then Senator Marco Rubio, now our distinguished Secretary of State. During his time as staff director of the CECC, he was part of the legislative team that passed and wrote the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, the Tibetan Policy and Support Act, and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So thank you very much, Peter, on your great work here. And finally, I want to introduce our third witness, Dr. Audrey Wong. Dr. Wong is a Jean Kirkpatrick Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Southern California. Her research covers China's economic statecraft, as well as China's foreign influence activities and propaganda campaigns. Dr. Wong received a PhD in security studies from Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs, where she was a National Science Foundation Graduate Fellow. So again, we have a very distinguished panel. We will begin with opening statements from each of our witnesses, and Admiral, we will begin with you.
Sir, thank you. Good morning, Chairman Solomon, Co-Chairman Smith, and distinguished members of this commission. Appreciate the kind introduction, and also, in addition to our time in Hawaii together in the Four Stars office, it was great to have you come over to the Office of Naval Intelligence for our chat. I valued that greatly, and hopefully it was useful to you. I spent 35 years in the military and at least half a dozen tours dealing with Indo-Pacific matters in one way or another. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss PRC political warfare against Taiwan. I'd like to open by describing my direct engagements with Taiwan over recent years. I visited Taiwan 3 times as the Director of Intelligence for Indo-PACOM. I happened to be the first 2-star active duty flag or general officer to visit Taiwan in over 40 years when I flew to Taipei to brief President Tsai in 2021. I was directed by the NSC and the OSD, Office of Secretary of Defense, to outline PRC military courses of action up to an invasion. During this briefing, and another one I delivered a year later in 2022 to share lessons from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I highlighted the most serious threats to Taiwan's survival. While we mainly discussed high-intensity combat operations under modern conditions, one of the major points I made was that Taiwan wouldn't survive if it only focused on an outside-in strategy of hardening its outer shell with military forces. Taiwan would need to apply equal efforts at strengthening its gooey center to ward off threats from the inside. Decades of PRC political warfare machinations had created vulnerabilities inside Taiwan that the PRC wouldn't hesitate to exploit during an attempted takeover. Taiwan would need to get real about these pre-existing omnidirectional threats. This conversation naturally led to discussions that went beyond merely stopping the PRC offshore or on the beaches to improving defense in-depth capabilities, urban operations, strengthening internal security, counterintelligence, fostering better civil-military coordination, and the merits of mobilizing society to engage in people's warlike actions that allow an inferior to defeat a superior. After my presentation, President Tsai declared she had waited 4 years for such a briefing, and she came over to me in a time of COVID, and we knocked elbows together. To Taiwan's credit, they had already passed an Anti-Infiltration Act in 2020 and taken other measures to protect themselves over time. But in the 3 years since those engagements that I had out in Taiwan, and as the PRC became more aggressive in all domains, Taipei has done even more to strengthen its porcupine defenses, including by fielding more asymmetric capabilities, and has undertaken a range of judicious measures to better protect itself internally. In my written testimony, I provided a specific list of actions Taiwan has taken or is in the process of taking to deal with persistent PRC attempts to co-opt, subvert, and manipulate Taiwan citizens. You should know that Beijing's political warfare efforts are relentless, pervasive, and all-encompassing. The aim of CCP political warfare is to isolate Taiwan internationally, weaken domestic support for either de jure or de facto independence, and soften the Taiwanese people's resistance to annexation. Beijing uses all instruments of national power to convince the Taiwan people that unification is inevitable and resistance is futile. It may be useful to think about Beijing's political warfare efforts as a highly orchestrated, interconnected, and multi-tiered set of activities that include white, gray, and black elements. White or overt means involve CCP diplomatic actions, official media propaganda, military operations, and trade relations that are all used as levers of influence. Gray or semi-overt means involve such actions as Chinese Coast Guard, maritime militia, and ghost fleet, encroachments in the maritime space, the use of foreign media to propagate and reinforce disinformation, funding and manipulation of political parties, discounted junkets for politicians, academics, journalists, and students to visit China, where they're then influenced by United Front Work Department reps, and co-option of social media influencers and celebrities, and so much more. Black or covert means involve agents in place for the purpose of espionage, influence, and/or sabotage, recruitment of former Taiwan military, police, and Coast Guard personnel, establishment of sleeper cells and weapons caches, offensive cyber operations, and activation of criminal groups such as the triads in Taiwan for various purposes ranging from harassment to potential assassinations. I've offered a number of ideas about how the U.S. might assist Taiwan in dealing with these clear and present dangers. A few of them include helping to strategically reduce Taiwan's international isolation, further encouraging Taiwan to spend more of its GDP on defense while giving due regard to their political and industrial realities, developing deeper Taiwan and U.S. cooperation on cybersecurity, and helping Taiwan upgrade its classified clearance system and adopt more advanced insider threat technologies. Thank you for the chance to testify, and I look forward to your Q&A.
Thank you, Admiral, and thanks again for your decades of service. You are truly one of the experts in the world, certainly in the United States, on these issues, and it's great to have you here.
Sure,
Turning to another expert, Mr. Mattis, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Sullivan and Co-Chairman Smith and all of the other members of the Commission. You know, this is a little bit of an odd hearing for CECC, but I think it's important to recognize that all of the tools that are applied against Taiwan are also applied in other areas that CECC cares a great deal about. These are fungible political tools that can be levered for these things. You know, as awareness of the Central Committee's United Front Work Department has grown, you know, never mind that there's an entire policy system associated with it, I don't think the awareness has grown of the approach. It is a sort of a theory of politics or a practice of politics that the party pursues. And it is fundamentally one that is defined by warfare and struggle, because it is about how do you identify your friends, how do you mobilize them, and how do you use them to convert neutrals and to strike or isolate your enemies. This is language that has been clear and consistent. Xi Jinping has used it, and it has been used all the way back to the founding of the party in the 1920s. As Admiral Suderman said, this is a global perpetual campaign against Taiwan, against the idea of the Republic of China, that this somehow has gone away, much less any sort of political future of Taiwan that is separate from the PRC and what the party chooses to define as China. I think it's worth noting that for decades the party's intentions have been clear, in part because there are many people that would like to deny that the CCP, using its armed wing, the People's Liberation Army, would choose to attack Taiwan. There are all sorts of reasons that this would be a terrible outcome. It could have trillions of dollars of consequences for the global economy. But we need to appreciate that this is where the party's intentions are and where they have stated this. It's easy to dismiss this as propaganda, but the statements that have been made are not simply speeches. They are directed to party cadre to guide them, to mobilize them, to tell them what is expected of their work, that this is one of the objectives that they are going after. The second is that if you look at the way the CCP has treated what it considers to be Chinese people, right? Whether you're talking about Uyghurs in East Turkestan, whether you're talking about Tibetans or Mongolians, but also many, many other Chinese, right? If you look at the statistics, something like 40 to 80 million people have died under the CCP, depending on how you count the Great Leap Forward and the famine that ensued. Things like the suppression campaign of Sichuan, supposedly after liberation, that killed hundreds of thousands of people, led by the so-called reformer Deng Xiaoping. And This is the kind of fate that is actually awaiting Taiwanese if the island is conquered. The third is that the CCP has been willing to take far higher costs to do certain things than external observers have ever been willing to give credit for. If you ask most Americans who are aware of the 1979 war with Vietnam, they will say Vietnam won, based only on the casualties that Beijing took. But if you look at the political objectives, did Vietnam learn the lessons that Beijing wanted? Did the Soviet Union learn the lessons that Beijing wanted? Did you look at the way in which the United States sort of responded positively and rewarded Deng Xiaoping for that war? They achieved everything politically, and last time I checked, war was about achieving some sort of political objective. As Admiral Suden mentioned, the intelligence cyber attacks inside Taiwan have been really quite remarkable, and there are a few new things that are worth highlighting, even though this has been constant. The first is that some sources have been forced to record videos of professing their loyalty to the PRC, so to be held back for a time of war, to be used for propaganda purposes of, here are other military officers or other soldiers saying, oh, well, actually, I profess my loyalty to the PRC. Another is the targeting of the Military Police Command, which has sort of increasingly stepped up because this is the presidential protection detail. It is about learning about where the leader is at all times and demonstrating real-time awareness of this. Because one of the lessons they learned off of the Ukraine war is that you don't want smart political leadership to survive. Internationally, we've seen a number of different things, from the campaign to sort of get countries to move recognition from the ROC to the PRC. And this is something where when you look at the countries that have done this, like the Solomon Islands, others, you can see a concerted effort to build influence with key politicians, mostly through the United Front system or through companies like Huawei investing in a telecom restructure in one province or another, to essentially build a relationship and make the flip happen by cultivating those individual leaders that work. More than 600 Taiwanese in the last decade have been extradited to the PRC from other countries. You know, if there's something more fundamental about sovereignty than your ability to take care of your citizens, it's hard to imagine what that would be. There have been perpetual efforts, especially since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, to use the UN Resolution 2758 to say that the UN has already settled what has taken place. It's already settled Taiwan's status. It's already settled that Taiwan is a part of China. And all it simply said is that the ROC cannot represent China in the UN, right? And that the PRC was the representative of that. In international organizations, the CECC was the one that was the organization responsible for highlighting that the World Bank was supporting the vocational training programs that were disguised for the mass incarceration and labor transfer programs in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Well, the same tools that allowed them to do that, control over budget and HR in the World Bank, are also what allowed them to block Taiwanese from working at the World Bank, except on anything other than a short-term contract. So all of this is really about trying to undermine Taiwan as a polity, as a society, as a separate, distinct political entity. And pushing back against this is, in fact, going to be a political act. This is something that Taiwan's politicians are going to have to decide about what is okay in terms of business, in terms of education, in terms of culture, in terms of entertainment, in terms of travel. What is acceptable or not? These are difficult decisions. Look at our own discussion about research security and how we cooperate with PRC companies. It is a deeply political question, and it's going to require presidents and parliamentarians in Taiwan to mobilize their population to talk about these issues in ways about what is the political choice, what do we want to do? And we really shouldn't punish Taiwan's politicians for having to carry on a conversation in a democracy, because the country that is actually destabilizing the status quo, which is of an ROC and a PRC that actually exist, is Beijing. It is the Chinese Communist Party. And we should punish those that are actually responsible.
Thank you, Mr. Mattis. Now, before we turn to Dr. Wong, I know Senator Kim has to leave here in a minute. Do you want to ask the witnesses any questions before you head up? Okay, and then I'd like Chairman Smith to be able to say a few words, if you'd like to, sir, and welcome. And then we'll turn to Dr. Wong for her testimony, and then we'll open it up for all members for questions. So, Mr. Chairman, floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your tremendous experience that you bring to bear as the new chairman of this commission. You know, nobody knows Taiwan like you do, and you have been a true leader when it comes to Taiwan, both when you wore the uniform and now. So I can't thank you enough. That enhances this commission in a very, very real way. You know, I've been on the commission for decades. I've chaired it, co-chaired it, and so glad to work with you. It's a privilege, and so I want to thank you for that. I do have a full opening statement. I was late because I was giving a major address on human trafficking, and I had a lot of questions from people, so I couldn't get out of there in time, so I apologize for my lateness. So I won't go through my opening statement. Maybe at the end I will, but I thank our witnesses. You know, this commission has made a difference over the years. Just ask Xi Jinping's Chinese Communist Party what they think of it. I'm barred, like so many other people, from going to China, in large part because of the work that we do here. I see Pastor Fu behind you, who's Bob Fu, just a tremendous leader on religious freedom, both, especially on mainland China. So it's just, you know, we need to do more. We need the human rights issues to be even more front and center than they are. I would note for the record, and I say that not as a partisan thing, but I always believe that we lost, and I actually wrote op-eds for it and joined Nancy Pelosi. We were joined on this one years ago when Bill Clinton delinked human rights from trade on May 26, 1994. That's when we lost China. They took the measure of us and said the only thing they care about in Washington, and Clinton, you know, having been an outspoken linkage guy to human rights and trade, totally delinked it on a Friday afternoon when everybody was leaving here. I did a press conference. Speaker Pelosi did a press conference, and we all said, how could you? I mean, the people of China have been hurt. The people of Taiwan, I think, by extension, get further at risk because of the Chinese Communist Party being so emboldened, enabled, and then from a military point of view, the dual-use items that were conveyed to them beginning then have made them a superpower militarily. And that is, unfortunately, very, very tragic. And it was all, I say it again, all preventable. Others have enabled over the years, but that was the pivotal time when we lost China. And I'm not the only one who thought it. We had the votes to sustain linking MFN with trade. And what happened? We never got the vote because it was all taken away with that one fell swoop of an executive order that delinked human rights from trade. So we've been doing catch-up ball ever since. And I find for the victims of name the abuse, whether it be forced organ harvesting and all the other abuses that are committed daily by Xi Jinping, and of course the existential threat that he poses to Taiwan. And again, to have people who know it, live it, understand it, we need to do more. And again, we have a chairman who understands Taiwan like nobody else in the U.S. House or Senate. So we are very blessed to have that. Again, I'll put my full statement in the record, but I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you,
look forward
Mr.
to serving
Chairman.
with you.
You too. Thank you very much. And thanks for your leadership and passion. And we're going to get a lot done here. So, Dr. Wong, you're up, and welcome.
Chairman Senator Sullivan and Congressman Smith, honorable members of the Commission, thank you for the invitation to testify today. In my remarks, I'd like to highlight a few main points. First, transnational repression against the Taiwanese diaspora and supporters of Taiwan is the tip of the spear of broader PRC political influence efforts in the United States and other free societies. Such activities are driven by, in large part, by the United Front Work Department, a CCP organ that seeks to co-opt allies and silence enemies domestically and abroad. And so in the context of Taiwan, that means suppressing supporters of Taiwanese democracy and independence and pushing the CCP sovereignty claims and narratives over Taiwan status. So transnational repression and political influence activities consist of multi-pronged community and political mobilization to not only engage in direct surveillance and harassment of Taiwan supporters on U.S. soil, but also to rally portions of the overseas Chinese and Chinese American communities to engage in public and highly visible displays of support for Beijing's position on Taiwan. right? So it's, we have, official United Front organizations like the Council of Promotion of the Peaceful Reunification of China, which has multiple branches in the United States and globally with the explicit goal of asserting Beijing's sovereignty claims over Taiwan. But these influence activities also involve the co-optation and mobilization of a broader array of overseas Chinese hometown associations and other grassroots organizations. And so if you look at Chinese writings on the United Front, they explicitly call for these societal organizations and overseas Chinese community leaders and elites to play a role in promoting Beijing's interests, including over Taiwan. And so these groups are often rallied, often in tandem with the Chinese consulate for public demonstrations and protests. For example, around former Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen's transit through New York and Los Angeles in late March and early April 2023. Right, and so through open source research, examining online videos and photos of these events, right, I was able to identify close to 30 groups involved in on-the-ground demonstrations. And there was one protest leader that claimed that over 100 of these community associations were represented in these demonstrations, right? And so they're gathered outside Taiwan's hotel or outside in LA, outside the Reagan Presidential Library, where President Tsai met then Speaker McCarthy, right? Waving Chinese and American flags, shouting slogans such as Taiwan's a traitor, and holding banners proclaiming Taiwan as part of China. And these protests also illuminate another trend that we're seeing, which is that the Chinese government also seeks to co-opt Western voices and form tactical alignments with domestic interest groups, such as far-left anti-imperialist movements in the United States. So in these protests in New York and Los Angeles, we see a number of these anti-war, anti-imperialist groups like Code Pink, Answer, Coalition, Pivot to Peace, protesting alongside Chinese groups, overseas Chinese associations and United Front-linked groups as well, right? And so in their messaging, they're framing U.S. support for Taiwan as part of U.S. imperialism and warmongering, and reframing China's position as one of preserving peace in the status quo. And so by extension, right, this implicitly recognizes Beijing's sovereignty claims over Taiwan, right? And so the Chinese government, may not be directly controlling these groups, but they see this as a way to further legitimize its narratives and reframe the Taiwan issue. And perhaps even more worryingly, we're seeing United Front actors reshaping the political landscape in the United States in favor of pro-Beijing actors, while suppressing supporters of Taiwan, right, with the goal of reshaping the public discussions and political discourse around the Taiwan issue. And so my own research and other reporting has examined how these Chinese Communist Party-linked groups and individuals not only try to get positions as political aides and power brokers in local and state politics, for example, but also are trying to increasingly act as a political machine of sorts to try to get pro-Beijing individuals into elected office, right? And so the Chinese government is playing identity politics, exploiting contentious social and political issues to such as anti-Asian hate and public safety, right, with the goal of gaining currency among overseas Chinese populations and legitimizing Beijing-linked individuals and organizations as grassroots leaders that are defending the community's interests and rights. And so this mobilization, right, then in turn serves as a foundation for Beijing's political machine to field preferred candidates and rally votes to get them elected, right? And this has direct implications for the Taiwan issue as well as other issues that the Beijing government, Chinese government cares about. So as one example, right, in New York City last year, during the election, a Republican candidate endorsed by United Front groups won a tight state Senate race against Taiwan-born Democrat incumbent Ewan Chu, who had attended a dinner when Taiwanese leader Tsai Ing-wen transited through New York in 2023. Right, and so these political influence tactics, even at the state and municipal levels, can have a very powerful trickle-up effect, right, where you get politicians who may be increasingly aligned with Beijing's interests or beholden to CCP-linked actors, right, and that has the ultimate effect of influencing broader policy discourse on Taiwan, on Xinjiang, on human rights in China, right, in favor of the Chinese government's positions. Now, just conclude with 2 points. which is, again, reiterating that the actors and tactics used in these cases, right, are just part of a broader pattern of intensifying PRC influence activities, right, not just stamping out Taiwanese quote-unquote separatism, right, but also trying to shape narratives and policies on Hong Kong, on Xinjiang, and even sort of getting involved in U.S. Politics. And the second point I'd like to conclude with is that these CCP political influence and interference operations, right, includes but goes beyond transnational repression, right? So there's definitely coercion, intimidation, surveillance, but there also, alongside that, there are also a lot of broader attempts at co-optation and control of overseas Chinese communities, right, who can have very diverse viewpoints and diverse backgrounds, right? And so they're really trying to change beliefs and behavior, right, and have the broader goal of ultimately shaping U.S. discourse on Taiwan and other issues that the Chinese Communist Party cares about. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wong, and thank you for your courage on testifying on a lot of these issues. We have votes and other hearings, so we're going to be kind of moving in and out here, some of the members, but I'll begin with my questioning of all the panelists. We'll have 5-minute rounds of questions. Let me begin just with the most basic question that I think, and I'd like to open it up to all of you, that I think every American should be aware of. You know, there's transnational issues all over the world, of course, but can you describe, and you already did it, Dr. Wong, but in other ways for other witnesses, how is the Chinese Communist Party on all of these issues taking actions in America? In America, right? That's the one that really, really, really boils my blood, right? So you mention it, you know, are they trying to influence our elections? By the way, the irony of that is huge. Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, they would never stand for elections. They fear their own people, we know that. But they're going to come and try and influence American elections? That is just unacceptable. And I don't care if you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, no American would want the Chinese Communist Party trying to influence our elections when these authoritarians would never have the guts to stand up for their own elections. So that's number one. But also in terms of intimidation. So how are they intimidating either Taiwanese citizens who are in the United States, Chinese citizens who are in the United States, or more importantly, from my perspective, Taiwanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Hong Kong Americans? How is the Chinese Communist Party trying to intimidate American citizens? You know, we read about these crazy police stations in New York City and stuff. We need to know about this because this is completely unacceptable. And I guarantee you, heck, even Code Pink might be against this, Dr. Wong, right? If the Chinese Communist Party is in our country trying to influence our wonderful democracy. So can I get a sense from all of you of exactly examples of how they're trying to do that, either through influencing our elections or intimidating American citizens of Taiwanese or Chinese or Hong Kong origin to be quiet, and what should we do about it? So I'm really interested in this question, and I think every single American, we need to know more about it. If the Chinese Communist Party is in America doing all these things, boy, oh boy, that is unacceptable, and I guarantee you every single American would agree with that. So you want to start, Admiral? You have a sense of this?
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you bringing this up. Probably the least discussed topic within the United States of America today that requires the most discussion and action. So I think it's fair to say that there's been a silent invasion of the United States. There was a book that was written
Silent Invasion.
Silent Invasion. There was a book written about that when Australia faced the same kind of things, and they addressed it, and they've taken measures to better protect themselves. We need to do so as well. I have a list of things that maybe would provoke some thought here about examples of Chinese influence. First of all, Hollywood remains beholden to CCP censors, and they're actively painting a benevolent PRC. And so we don't have the entertainment industry that's available to describe these things to the American people in a way that they might, over time, come to understand, particularly if they distrust government. But government itself has failed, I think, to be able to
So can you
describe
just
all
on
this.
the, sorry, I want to make sure you get through all your list, but just on that, Hollywood is beholden to Chinese communist censors. That's a pretty dramatic statement, right? Hollywood's very powerful in America, around the world. Do they go to the, masters in Beijing and say, please, Mr. Xi Jinping, is it okay to do a movie or not a movie? Like, how bad is that?
So there is less dependency today on the Chinese market because many movies can't actually go there and profit the way they used to. But for many years, the movie makers would, in fact, if they wanted to sell their movie in China, they would allow their scripts to be reviewed by the CCP censors. And over time, they knew what the left and right limits were, and then they could self-censure, which is actually a metric of the success of political warfare when you self-censure because you know what you're supposed to say and not to say.
Yeah, that's shameful.
Right. Other issues, universities have been hooked on Chinese tuition dollars. Academic freedom has been threatened. There are examples of this. Scientific and laboratory cooperation continues to transfer the seeds of innovation to the Chinese. There's been recruitment of ethnic Chinese from inside the U.S. government and businesses, influence attempts at the local and state level designed to create dependencies that then the Chinese can leverage, including pressure on the federal system, multimedia influence operations with Chinese-owned or influenced media capabilities in our country and globally, purchases of property near U.S. sensitive facilities and bases, which we're getting after, of course, thanks to Congress's help. We have operations inside U.S. critical infrastructure that CISA has talked about, but this is at the national all the way to the municipal level in the United States. Cyber espionage has been well covered, but that continues to be $200 to $600 billion. That's trillions of dollars of U.S. IP that has gone over to fuel China's modernization and their rise. Also buying stakes in U.S. companies to get tech secrets. All of these are part of sort of standard CCP exploitation malign actions. There's been discussion about many of these things. We've taken certain actions to strengthen our capabilities, but I think we have a long way to go.
Great, thank you. Mr. Mattis?
So I think you can find worldwide some examples of the CCP trying to influence elections, but real power is not caring what the election outcome is because you've cultivated the people around a candidate or a candidate themselves. And when you look at the targeting in Taiwan, in Australia, in the United States, it is the same. It is the same piece. You can see examples. What you see in Canada, what you see in the United States, is what you see in Taiwan, Australia, elsewhere. And it is the effort to cultivate the individual candidates and the people around them because, today's council member, today's mayor is tomorrow's governor, tomorrow's senator, have you. So you can cultivate people going through the system and shape the way they understand China, the PRC, Taiwan. And if you think about how you interact with your constituents, right, you don't call every single constituent and try to get them to a place. You go to the Kiwanis Club, the Rotary Club. You go to schools. You go to places where people gather. And that's the core of what Audrey was describing with the United Front system, of cultivating these organizations so that when you say, I've got 500,000 Chinese Americans as constituents, maybe I need to go find a way to speak to them. These groups are fundamentally stealing their voice as citizens and now representing the party with pretending that they're representing American citizens to you to say, here's what we want, even though that we is actually the party, not those supposed groups. And that's one of the ways that those groups are, in fact, dangerous, that it's the party taking people's voice and providing it. Another way is that the cultivation of officials. So if you think about the charges that were put against Linda Sun, a former New York State government official, right? She was a liaison to the Asian American community. So if you were Taiwanese American or if you were Uyghur American and you were going through her, you were seeing things blocked. You were not getting a response from the state government. And sort of pro-PRC interests that were being represented through the state would continue to funnel through and reach the attention of state officials. So you could see someone who was blocking these issues out not representing all of the Americans that she ostensibly represented or that New York State represents, but only those that Linda Sun and the people that she worked with from the PRC government approved of. And so you can continue looking down all these examples, but what we're talking about is really threats to economic opportunity and creation of economic opportunity. So the payoff to Linda Sun was that her husband got a lot of contracts to the tune of several $1 million, allegedly, from the PRC. And so it's much harder to go after those kinds of relationships because they're a problem. And this is why it is a conversation that has to be discussed publicly. What's acceptable, what's not.
Yep.
Because we're not going to arrest our way out of this.
Dr. Wong, you have a view on some of these?
Yeah, I think just sort of building on what Peter said and my previous comments, right? I think it's a very challenging issue because, it's not just sort of the CCP claiming to represent the voices of Chinese Americans or, anyone of ethnic Chinese descent, right? Because the CCP sees all ethnic Chinese as having some inherent or innate affinity or loyalty to China and the Chinese government, even though that is certainly not the case. Right, so that is a threat not just to national security, but also to the strength of our democracy and the rights and liberties of Chinese American communities and overseas Chinese, right? And as Peter mentioned, right, this comes about because of reliance on these community liaisons who come out of the woodwork and say, I'm here to get your votes, right? And so it's easy for politicians and sort of political candidates to rely on that. As a way, and I think that element of patronage politics, right, provides a way for foreign influence and interference to operate in U.S. elections. And the sort of the dominant way that the CCP tries to sort of influence U.S. elections, right, is through sort of positioning themselves as the sole representative and the only spinning the narrative, right? The Chinese government is the only one looking out for Chinese Americans and ethnic Chinese communities. And so sort of using this identity-based mobilization and sort of getting involved in community organizing to position themselves as leaders of these communities and say, we are here to take care of you. The American political system is marginalizing your voice, right? And that is sort of a way that weaponizes sort of a lot of the social and political issues within the United States to drive a wedge between these overseas Chinese communities and broader American society. And so I think that's a really important trend to note. And I think sort of another example you asked about sort of intimidation of Taiwanese or Chinese Americans. I think if you think about sort of in academia and higher education, right, where sort of some of this United Front influence has permeated these campuses, where again you see sort of some zealous Chinese students or Chinese student organizations sort of taking up the mantle of CCP interests for a range of reasons, right? It could be sort of ideological support. It could be sort of practical sort of career incentives, a desire to sort of get a leg up, when they return home and then get the job, right? Sort of there are these incentives to sort of associate with the Chinese consulate, to get resources and to sort of engage in peer monitoring, surveillance of other Chinese students on campus to report on potential events, potential ways that supporters of Taiwan or opponent critics of the CCP regime, right, are sort of exercising their freedom of speech on campus. So I think that is sort of another complementary element of transnational repression.
Great, thank you. I'm going to head to a vote, speaking of voting and democracy. And I will turn it over to Chairman Smith and for more questions, and I will be back after this vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you to our very distinguished witnesses. A couple of questions. We all have 5 minutes, so I will be as brief as I can. Is the United States government doing enough, using all of the assets we have, including the FBI, to combat this repression that's happening within our own borders? Is there a resolve there? Are sufficient numbers of people? I mean, we do have a Transnational Repression Act that we're trying to get passed in the House, but that said, there's already authorities there. Are they doing enough? Secondly, after Afghanistan, I read the Global Times all the time. I was in it once when they put me on their hit list and sanctions list. But my question is, after Afghanistan, there was one editorial after another to the people of Taiwan that the United States will not have your back, and they cited the withdrawal from Afghanistan as a proof positive. Has that abated with the new president, or is it still a part of their narrative? Third, on offshore wind, I've been leading the effort in the House in exposing that offshore wind carries egregious negative consequences to radar, where you will not see your own planes, ships will not see ships that are right in front of you. The National Academy of Sciences did in 2022 a big, thick, voluminous, well-documented, heavily footnoted study that said there's no workaround. Radars will be rendered inferior and if not defunct completely, and yet we're looking to build them off my coast, and I'm fighting it like crazy. Taiwan has a similar problem, and I know academics and others have spoken about the impact it might have for their national security, and Admiral, you might want to speak to that, because I think if you're blind, you don't see what's coming, and your own planes can't even operate in a way that's effective, then you've got a problem, and your security is, Senator Berkeley, did you want to ask a question before you go? Oh, you're going to come back. Great, great. Thank you. So if you could maybe speak to that. Even Norway and countries that are afraid of Putin, they have been raising alarms about offshore wind. And, you know, again, there's 5 studies. The most important one of all is the National Academy of Sciences. And they have said, watch out. You know, we have a real problem with this in terms of our national security and aviation that's civilian as well. Again, on this issue, right behind you is Bob Fu. 2 weeks ago, big gathering right here in the Capitol on the oppression of the Muslim Uyghurs. His wife was accosted by a provocateur who got this close to her in order to incite something. Bob's house, when it was in Texas, had all of these people from the Chinese Communist Party making life miserable. He had to move. And so another manifestation of this transnational repression. So again, going back to the first question, how well or poorly are we doing? Is it a priority?
Sir, thanks for the question. I think there's been substantial effort that's been executed over many years, but too few people with too little capacity, with too little awareness and education of the American public have been striving to deal with these issues. And so instead of it being sub rosa or something we just simply can't find a way to talk about, I think we need to actually let sunlight be the best disinfectant and to work on apolitical education of our people on exactly what's going on. People tend to think that tyranny and spy games and things that you read about in the 20th century with the Cold War is over. The tyranny never dies. It's actually resurging in more places and more forms than ever before, and we have to deal with it, and it's going to require everybody in the country, every citizen, to be alert, to be vigilant, to know what is happening in order for them to be able to take care of those things at the earliest possible stage and not simply rely on consequence management from the federal government all the time. But this is going to require, in my humble opinion, a national conversation. And it's going to have to be led by various key influencers in lots of different sectors in our society. And we haven't had that conversation yet. This is one thing we should all agree on when it comes to the security and the prosperity, you know, of our country and so many others. So I wrote an op-ed at one point, and I recommended that we have an apolitical spokesperson for China Matters who essentially is up at the White House, who has credentials, who isn't a political, to be able to do press conferences and explain to the American people how to connect the dots about Chinese stratagems and ambitions, how they relate to other red or malicious actors, because they're working together with Russia and others, and then, how to think through how all these things are connected. Until we have such a spokesperson, until we have the entertainment industry turn itself on and become patriotic and do their duty, I'm afraid this will still be something that without situational awareness, only a few people will be able to tackle.
Did you want to speak to the offshore wind?
On offshore wind on Taiwan, I would just tell you that they need to go green to diversify their energy sources. So they can't be so beholden to liquid natural gas. That is a choke point that the Chinese could potentially squeeze in a crisis. And so diversification is really important. I agree with the solar and the wind steps that they've taken. I believe they need to have at least one nuclear plant to stay viable. And I think they need to think through other resilience methods so that they deny the PRC an easy ability to cut off energy flows into Taiwan.
So I think I'll take the propaganda question first, which is, has the Beijing's message that the U.S. is unreliable abated? And the answer is no. It has been continuous. It has been reinforced. And one of the big trends in the way that the PRC has conducted political warfare against Taiwan, going back about 8 years or 9 years, is a deliberate focus on Taiwanese pundits, people with platforms to speak to the Taiwanese people, to try to push these narratives through, because it's much easier to have it come through someone who is Taiwanese than it is to have it come through, the Global Times or the People's Daily or some other mouthpiece. However, is the U.S. doing enough? We simply don't have enough resources and enough awareness because, as I mentioned before, you can't arrest your way out of this. We can't prosecute our way out of this. There are simply too many things in too many ways. And what we actually need is the good judgment of citizens about what is, if it's not illegal, but it may not be okay. We have lots of things, as parents, as citizens, as people, as congressional members, as staffers, that, well, it's not illegal, but it's not really okay. Or we make these kinds of judgments. And to be able to make that awareness in the face of this information that's coming to you, or an ostensibly community leader who you think is speaking for a number of your constituents, it's hard to do that without a lot of awareness. And this is a place where we have not made a lot of investments. As you may remember, Chairman Smith, the bilateral competition bills from the 116th and 117th Congresses, right? There was not a single dollar in what was about 2,000 pages total of legislation about funding education in Chinese language, about replacing Confucius Institutes with sort of Americans or with Taiwanese or with others rather than sort of PRC funded push to shape how universities behaved. This is a place where we're woefully underprepared in the U.S. government. One of the reasons why, for example, some of our regulations on China have been woefully underenforced was because some departments had to use Google Translate because they did not have a single Chinese speaker who could assist in the research that they were required to do to take policy action. So it is a bigger educational problem. Language is just one part of it, but it is a fundamental part of this because the number of Chinese language students in the United States peaked over a decade ago, I believe in 2013. And it's been on a steady decline since, but that's simply not going to work with the need to have a public conversation of exploiting the need for the CCP to communicate to its people and its cadre and its collaborators out in the public eye because they have to explain some of these things.
Sure, I would agree that we definitely need more rather than less government resources, right, to study and respond to these issues in a cross-agency and bipartisan manner, right? And so that includes sort of continuing to bolster the Foreign Influence Task Force at the FBI, or, continuing dedicating resources to study foreign influence, foreign disinformation, authoritarian propaganda, right? And so I think these are efforts that we sort of need to be pushing forward rather than scaling back. And I think it's important to do this not just at the federal level, but also at the subnational level. So at the local and state levels, increasing awareness among elected officials, among politicians, among local governments, right, about the ways that the CCP works, United Front works, how sort of tactics of foreign influence in transnational repression so that they have the capacity and hopefully the resources, right, to understand how this works and then take the corresponding steps to tackle it. And again, transparency is really important. And the final point I want to make is that, I think that also reducing Chinese influence on the ground also requires empowering, encouraging alternative legitimate voices, right, in the form of grassroots organizations and legitimate Asian American community organizations, right? They're actually responsive to the diverse local interests and needs so that CCP voices are not able to dominate the community organizing landscape or political landscape and claim to represent the Chinese American and Asian American communities.
Thank you, Dr. Wong. Chair recognizes Commissioner Dale Strong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to join you today in my first hearing as a member of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China. First and foremost, I want to express my sincere gratitude to Speaker Johnson for the trust and confidence placed in me through this appointment. I'm deeply humbled by the opportunity and look forward to working collaboratively with all members of the Commission to advance our shared goals of promoting human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. I'm proud to represent Huntsville in North Alabama, a hub for all things research and innovation throughout defense, cyber, logistics, aerospace, and sectors. This being said, I'm particularly excited for this committee's work surrounding these topics. Admiral, how do China's gray zone tactics like harassing ships near Taiwan connect with its larger political and information campaigns against Taiwan? What's the strategic goal of this coordinated effort?
Thank you, Congressman. So multifaceted, so the way to think about things, I think, beginning from the strategic is that China's not going to work with the current President Lai. He is the worst possible political leader that they could envision, with somebody that talks about Taiwan as a sovereign nation and is willing to speak about this often, with much of his history being firebrand about these issues. And so they believe that they should be penalizing not just the leadership to show that they are less effective or ineffective in being able to defend Taiwan, but also to punish the voters that put them in power. And so they are stress testing Taiwan. They are trying to exhaust the military as part of that punitive effort. They are surrounding it to show that it'll be cut off, that there'll be no chance of rescue. This is a psychological warfare attempt to show that that they won't have cavalry coming over the hill, or if it tries, it can't get there. At the same time, they are changing and conditioning Taiwan to seeing more forces more forward more often, which, if you're looking at it through military terms, reduces your indications and warning, and it buys more surprise that the PRC can then use in the future, should they plan a major military campaign. It's also a chance to rehearse, as Admiral Paparo in Indo-PACOM has said, to give them a practice in the actual wartime op areas here. So this is a strategic, operational, and tactically something that the Chinese are doing to advantage them, but also to try to show that Taiwan has no hope of defending itself, even if there are intervening forces.
Admiral Subin, in your opinion, are U.S. law makers aware of how deep China's non-military tactics like propaganda or legal maneuvering are woven into its long-term strategy and military plans for Taiwan?
I believe those who study this problem in foreign policy and military circles know it well. I don't think enough people, though, are educated on this facet of how the PRC works. There's all spectrum, all the time, all domains. It's more insidious than we want to give it credit. And as my fellow panelists have described, this is ambiguous. This is truly sort of gray zone. And so people don't know how to deal with it if we don't talk about it and we don't equip them with the way of thinking about how to respond to it and do it in a judicious way. that doesn't kind of violate what we stand for in this democracy, still protecting free expression and other things that we're going to require to protect going forward. So I think we can do more to shine a light on those tactics, and there are people that are in positions of influence who should be doing it.
A little further into that, do you believe Indo-PACOM is giving enough attention to information and political warfare, and are we ready to compete with China effectively in these areas?
So Indo-PACOM and many other combatant commands certainly get it. Much of the Admiral Paparo's Prevail strategy, as he calls it, has information highlighted in it. He describes that every military operation should be suffused with information elements. The problem is that one military, officer in charge of the Pacific can't do it alone. When it comes to dealing with these things, you need support up the chain of command, and you need to have the National Security Council be working interagency efforts to use all instruments of national power, including the strategic messaging components that exist at the national level, to be able to support and complement what would be happening out in a place like Indo-PACOM. This is where we've been weak. In fact, we're today gutting some of those diplomatic and informational capabilities that we're going to need to compete and contest in the very area that you talk about.
Mr. Matthews, how does espionage play a role in the China's political warfare, and what effect does this have at the individual and societal level, both here in the United States and with our allies and partners?
So first and foremost, espionage is an act of violating trust. And if you think about all of the interactions that are required, for example, in Congress, among staff in an office, trust is fundamental to that issue. And so when you have these cases, when you have the weaponization of any connection to the PRC to try to gain access to information to people, you are breaking down the bonds of trust that allow government to work, that allow actions to be taken with some degree of appropriate secrecy when governments need to act in those ways. And you inhibit the ability of a government to have a private conversation about how to deal with matters. How does it affect Taiwan? It affects the ability of the government to work with itself. It affects the ability of the trust that Taiwan's partners have in dealing with that government. It affects the kinds of decisions about what is acceptable to share, both in terms of information, what weapons are acceptable to sell, what kind of interoperability or plans for interoperability are acceptable. These are all things that get factored in, or all things that are affected by the CCP's espionage against Taiwan.
Thank you. My time has expired. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Senator Kim.
Thank you. And I just want to say I'm glad to be a part of this commission and glad to work alongside the two of you and others. So thank you for your leadership and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you to the three of you for coming out and talking about such an important issue. Admiral, I'd like to start with you, just kind of talk through, you talked about the PRC's actions in terms of mobilizing that sense of national power, one that is not just military, also includes so many other tools, whether that be political, information, economic. So I guess I just wanted to make sure I understand, when it comes to the work that the United States is doing as well as what Taiwan is doing, is it correct that we need to make sure we're not focusing too narrow just on the military deterrence side? That's certainly critically important, but so many of the other issues need to be addressed with equal level of importance. Is that a good assumption to start with?
Senator, that's exactly right. And so, look, we need to understand the playing field or the battlefield that we're on. This is about global influence over time, where China is trying to exert itself and create leverage and essentially begin to expand its influence at the expense of ours and our friends and the rest of the Western rules-based system, to be able to transform it to meet their preferences. They're not going to try to trash all elements. They can co-opt many of those. But the Chinese are taking over inside international institutions. Obviously, about the Belt and Road, extending their influence in a way where we need to compete. And you can't compete if you don't have healthy, robust instruments of national power that are ready to work together to orchestrate the kinds of things that we're going to need to do to deal with that reality that's happening around the world, not just here at home. And so, in my humble opinion, we need not to, euthanize major critical elements of our government that support what we're talking about. Yeah. We also need to understand that we have to be sophisticated in our approach. We actually have to do trust-generating things with our international partners. We need to think about what, true smart power really is. Like Joe Nye would say, right? It's the soft, it's the sharp, and it's the hard. It's not just the hard or the sharp all the time. That would not be smart power. The Chinese are using smart power cleverly in many places around the world constantly to gradually, steadily turn the tide against the United States and supplant us there. And we need to be wise to this, and we also need to use our instruments wisely. So I do think some of the changes that are occurring in government are very dangerous. To me, it's like Superman choosing to swallow kryptonite at exactly the wrong time.
Yeah, and look, I mean, beyond just our own tools, and I say this as someone who used to work at the State Department, engaged in a lot of these different efforts, but would I be correct as well in sort of trying to make sure that we're conceptualizing a strategic advantage of ours being our capacity to be able to build international coalitions, and especially when you go on and competing and having the challenges against a competitor which has as large of a population and an economy and resources as China, am I correct in thinking that being able to build international coalitions, that is not just a good to have, nice to have, but that is a necessary component if we were to try to truly compete and be able to truly try to protect people, not just in Taiwan, but around the world?
I believe that our work with all countries around the world, allies, partners, all of it is going to be very important, that we have to be mindful of their respective interests. We need to do things that build trust, not reduce it. Credibility isn't divisible. Either you have it or you don't. And the same may be true, of trust. And so instead of breaching it, we need to do more to build it. We're going to have to earn it. We're going to have to earn the moral high ground here in the international system. And I worry about where brand America is heading, given the trends.
Yeah, the word you use there, credibility, I think that's really important. I would also use the word reliability in terms of whether or not we are there for our allies and our partners and that they feel like they can trust us, because certainly that is something that is so critical. Mr. Mattis, I want to just turn to you. I mean, what we see so much in Taiwan, and we've heard it in the briefing as well as more broadly, is that often it's a testing ground for the United Front and for political warfare tactics. So I guess I just wanted to hear from you a little more. What are the most concerning developments in this space, and what tactics could Beijing use in other democracies?
So I tend to disagree with people who call Taiwan a testing ground. Okay. I think of it as more the place where the CCP has the least restrictions and the least sort of ethical restraints on anything that it does, because its political objective of dissolving the ROC, of annexing Taiwan, mean that it has no view of restraint. It's not competing for influence in some country with the United States, or it's not about affecting this type of decision or one thing. It is actually about the destruction of Taiwan as a society, as a political entity.
I think I respect your thought there. I was just trying to clarify. I think for me, some of what I'm seeing taking place in Taiwan, I feel like I saw some initial precursors to that in Hong Kong, for instance, and how the PRC repressed voices in that front, and you're seeing it now mobilized and in fact expanded in Taiwan. And I'm just trying to think through, how is that continuing to grow, and what is it that we can do to try to be concerned about that and address
some of the things that are fundamental to this are sort of a widespread effort to go after people who have any sort of platform and influence in a broader population, because a Taiwanese voice is much better than a Chinese voice in explaining, what to try to put pressure on or to affect the cognition psychology of Taiwanese. The second is the very focused effort on going after local level politicians, local level associations, local businesses, because The political structure in Taiwan is far less centralized. The Kuomintang used to be a Leninist party, and it had that kind of structure. And that central part has fallen away. And the DPP has, grew up out of pro-democracy activists. And so it has a decentralized way of doing things. And therefore, the ability to focus on local levels in Taiwan and to really try to sort of cultivate the next generation of politicians and push them into office and provide the financial resources through business opportunities is particularly disconcerting because it's intense, it's difficult to spot, and it starts, if you want to start shaping it, you're having to say, this kind of interaction with the PRC is okay, this kind is not. And this gets very uncomfortable for democracies to make these kinds of political judgment calls. And therefore, it also requires you having a political discussion, the ability for a president or legislature to mobilize people around these questions for national security and protect. The third area that I find particularly disconcerting is, I had mentioned this when you had stepped away, is the effort to understand the real-time movements of the president of Taiwan and other leaders, that this sort of focused effort on the military police command, trying to find bodyguards, trying to find anyone who could be in this position to demonstrate awareness of where the president is. Because if you're thinking about how to paralyze a political system in a moment of crisis, going after the leaders is a key way of doing this.
Thank you. Congressman Nunn.
Well, thank you to the Commission. Thank you very much to both of our chairs here. I think this is a great opportunity to have not only a bipartisan conversation, but a bicameral approach. Admiral, you highlighted the need for not only a whole of government, but really a whole of nation response to China on this. So I'll offer you one as a fellow intelligence officer here. In 2020, it started with a pineapple. I was working a counter-influence operation, and we saw in rural Taiwan a group, unbeknownst to many of us, started going after pineapple farmers. And slowly, by prefecture after prefecture, they were able to identify that the pineapple farmer was going to be a linchpin in the 2020 election. They messaged directly to them, and unbeknownst to us at the time, 98% of pineapple exports ended up in mainland China. And the ability to influence a pineapple farmer, and I'm a guy from Iowa who knows very much the commodities market, meant that they were going to be influenced when they went to that ballot box. Down ballot, the Chinese ability to micro-target individuals within the voting population within central Taiwan certainly had an outcome in both what the DPP and the KMT, the mainland China party, saw in their local elections. This was strategic, it was effective, and without a shot fired, they were able to change the course of an election, arguably through legal means. This is what George Kennan has identified as political warfare. I'll be very specific here. The employment of all the means at a nation's command short of war to achieve its national objective. I want to turn to you, Admiral. You worked in national intelligence in a number of ways, including your time in the Indo-PACOM theater here. When we look at China, do you believe China has the ability to effectively deploy, even through its Mandarin-based language learning models, the ability to launch influence operations against actors in Taiwan today?
It's not a question of, could they? They are doing it all the time.
I would agree. Do you believe they could go the next step and cross that Great Pacific and start doing influence operations in the United States today?
They don't need to cross the Pacific. They're already here, and they're already doing it.
I would agree. Do you believe that the types of things that we're seeing them orchestrate in Asia today, particularly, election manipulation, could be executed here in the United States today?
It's already happened, and it will happen again in the future.
This is very concerning, and I think this is what needs to be at the forefront of where we are operating as a commission, to be able to identify not only what the Chinese are doing to their neighbors, what they're doing right here in the United States. Mr. Mathis, you and I spent some time in counterintelligence at the agency together, and I think we've seen firsthand the threat that's posed by this. When I look at the United States today, I believe we need a whole-of-nation approach, as the Admiral highlighted, but what I see coming out of Beijing right now is a nationalized whole-of-information operation where they're using everything from industry, export controls, cyber campaigns to this very targeted political warfare. Are we in a position right now where we can counter this type of operation here in the United States, and do we even have insight into it? It was mentioned earlier, understanding Mandarin. The only way we found out about the pineapple farms was using, large language models to break down after the fact the messaging coming from mainland China into Taiwan. It's happening, as the Admiral highlighted, right in front of us. I don't even know if we're aware of it and in a position to be able to counter it. I'd like your thoughts.
So I think this is why I highlighted at the very beginning of my testimony that we may understand that there's a United Front Work Department, usually referencing the one for the Central Committee, but there are provincial United Front Work Departments. There are local United Front Work Departments. There is a whole Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference system that has roughly 715,000 members, which is something that you could roughly describe as like a militia system, if you will, or a reserve system for the United Front that's mobilizing business people, retired officials, actually one branch of the Kuomintang that split off, and a whole range of other sort of actors that are outside of the party. There's also a United Front Work Department, by the way, in, say, the China Academy of Sciences. It's also in certain companies. It's even in sometimes Western companies that have full-fledged party committees. And as a result, you see something that is an entire system that is operating. And it's worth noting that the guidance that has been given to United Front by Zhou Enlai and has continued to be quoted these days begins with understand the situation, have a firm grasp of policy, arrange personnel, and that's the prerequisite for acting. So what the reason why this is effective and why it's so difficult to deal with is that the party has making very, very clear what its objectives are. This is what our policies are. And then saying to all of these sort of hundreds of thousands of people, go do what you can to push that forward. And that's why it's such a difficult challenge, because in a military context, the United Front system is operating on mission orders, if you will. That's right. We've equipped you for brilliance in the basics, we've given you the guidance, now go do it. And it becomes a question of how do you isolate the Uyghur cause? How do you isolate Taiwanese? How do you steal technology? How do you help us recruit intelligence sources? It is a capability, in a sense. Or if you're thinking of ends, ways, and means, United Front could probably be described as a way, right? Of a way of approaching politics and influence and creating this mobilizational capability that can be there. And that means it can be used for propaganda, but it can also be used for political action. And that's what makes it so difficult to deal with, because it's not a question of whether it's legal or illegal. The party doesn't care about that. It cares about its objectives and creating this ability to leverage to push those forward.
I would very much agree. Ms. Wang, on the time that I have remaining, I want you to know we're leading a bipartisan CODEL to Taiwan later this year. The intent here is not only to stand with our allies, but also to do some fact-finding, some discovery. I think both those in the United States, but also, I would say, in Taiwan, who've been on the front line of this for quite some time, are coming up with some really innovative ways that they're responding to this type of Chinese pressure campaign, political warfare, to be very specific. Do you have any, early indications that we're able to find some kind of defense, some kind of countermeasure here to be able to put into this space, not only to help the United States, but as was noted, to be able to stand with our allies in pushing back against the false narratives coming out of Beijing, intending to both manipulate, conscript, and coerce allies in the region into falling into Beijing's sphere further?
I absolutely agree that it's important for the U.S. to stand by Taiwan and to coordinate, capacities and resources to be able to combat authoritarian influence efforts. I think the United States probably has some learning could do from Taiwan, who has been dealing with these issues for a long time. And I think it's important for the United States also to sort of continue its global commitment to combating foreign disinformation, to sort of make sure that alternative messaging through from the United States and its allies and partners gets out there, and that it's not, and it doesn't leave a gap or a void for the CCP and its narratives to take root, especially in places where, there's relatively little knowledge of Taiwan and the complexities of these issues.
Thank you. I'd just like to close by saying, Admiral, you've seen this firsthand. I could not agree with you more. I'd like to be able to see, in an ideal world, a bipartisan voice at the White House. I don't know that's always the case, but certainly a National Security Council that can help orchestrate not only all of our instruments of government power, but also all of our instruments of national power. And if my 18-year-old daughter can be an influencer and do quite well in her ability to encourage young people in a certain way. We, as the United States, should be a force for good in the world and shine light on bad actors while also having the opportunity to project what's great about democracies like Taiwan, like the United States. Thank you very much for your service. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield my time.
Congressman Nunn, we'll work with you on my, before you head over to Taiwan, on my Stand with Taiwan Act. It's got a very strong bipartisan group of senators over here, and it's, I think, part of what you're talking about right now. We want to make sure it's got a strong bipartisan support in the House, too. Great. Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony. And I'm going to start, Admiral Studeman, with your phrase regarding the silent invasion of the United States. Freedom House has documented over 1,200 incidents of repression by China since 2014. And we've had previous testimony of transnational repression here in the United States, ranging from somebody walking up to a Chinese member of the diaspora and saying, we know who you are, we know where you live, to direct threats of their family members back in China. Do we have a sense, if in tracking the increase over the last decade of where we were a decade ago in terms of the number of incidents, the presence of China engaging in these types of acts of intimidation, affecting freedom of assembly, affecting freedom of speech here in the United States? How does 2015 compare to 2025, if you will?
Sir, I don't have the statistics on that. I'm sure somebody does. Maybe my fellow panelists have some data, but one can essentially say that there is pressure to continue to do more around the world, not just here, as part of the sort of the political direction from Beijing to deal with any anti-China voices that exist anywhere. I think if you go back historically, I think I recall in 1984 there's an assassination of a Taiwan person, and so done by, I think, some criminal gang that was working as a proxy for the PRC. And so, look, the idea of pressure in all forms up to killing, including rendering in a variety of different ways, all that stuff has happened on our soil. And we need to understand that that's sort of the brutal fact of our existence, that we're going to have to confront these dangers and figure out a way to protect those who are here that might face those kind of approaches by CCP and their proxies.
Thank you, and Mr. Mattis, thank you for your work on this commission and your engagement in this. It has been my impression that we are probably only seeing the tip of the iceberg, that most people who are affected through acts of transnational repression here in the United States don't report it. There's not a comfortable way to do so. One of the things that I've advocated for is for us to create a better pathway and better information on how folks can report such incidents so we can better track over time what China is doing. And if we aren't understanding what they're doing, it's hard for us to craft ways to deter it or respond to it. What's your sense of that last decade in terms of increase in Chinese activity here in the United States?
My sense is not necessarily about the number of incidents, because that's almost impossible to track. It is let's say, what they are willing to do on U.S. territory or in foreign countries that has steadily ramped up. So it might have been, let's call it a semi-polite notice of, we know who you are type thing, ramping up to physical altercations. Example that took place in the UK was they went after someone who, from Hong Kong, they flew in at a private airfield. They intended to fly out with her, and it was disrupted, and they were caught on camera. But that kind of direct rendering or that kind of pressure is something that you know that has happened in the United States. Maybe not in quite that way, but certainly the kind of direct pressure of you will go to Beijing and be there in the next 48 hours or else. So those kinds of things have gone from, in a sense, relatively minor if you were in a criminal sense, you might call it a misdemeanor, up to things that are now, actual felonies.
Thank you. Ms. Wong, one thing that caught my attention in your testimony, in a paragraph where you're talking about TNR, transnational repression activities, consist of multi-pronged community and political mobilization. You mention the broader and public discourse on Taiwan through the positioning of pro-Beijing individuals as political aides. Are you referring that to happening here in the United States, or are you referring to that happening in Taiwan?
I was referring to that happening in the United States, as we see the recent arrest of Linda Sun, who is a former aide to the New York governor. She positions herself as a community liaison, but had, very close links to United Front and the CCP. So they're claiming to speak on behalf of the Asian American and Chinese American community, but actually propagating, Chinese government viewpoints and positions, and by extension circumscribing the New York governor or other sort of politicians who were their aides to, right, and sort of shaping their views on what is permissible to say or not to say on Taiwan and Xinjiang and other cases.
Great. I'd like to have the staff of the commission follow up with you on the details of that. And your second half of that sentence was operating as a political machine to get pro-Beijing candidates elected into office. And this is what we're talking about, election influence in the U.S. and really wanting to understand the scope of that much more broadly. The last question I want to pose, because my time's expiring, is and that's a question I've posed on every one of these gatherings, is what is an effective strategy to respond? There are one thing that I have pressed for is for the FBI to have a hotline with Chinese-speaking individuals and high security so people feel comfortable reporting incidents of transnational repression when they occur. The FBI has been very reluctant to have any sort of dedicated effort in that regard. A second is, so are there things that should trigger specific responses in terms of, for example, trade sanctions? And the chairman has mentioned that in the context of military aggression. But are there things that, in terms of transnational repression, that should trigger responses? If there's documented incident of the Chinese government engaging in some of these escalated events that we're starting to hear about, does that increase their tariff of products coming into the U.S.? Or what other leverage tools are there for us to really dramatize the unacceptability of China interfering in our freedom of speech and our freedom of assembly? Whoever would like to take a stab at that.
Senator, if you have a persistent, comprehensive, never-ending threat, then you need to deal with it with persistence, with comprehensive strategies that go up and down the chain, so it's both the depth and the breadth. This, to me, is one of the only ways to approach that kind of wicked problem that's being presented to us. And so we talked about education as a starting point. To me, this is something that has to be part of a continuing conversation with the country, but I do think that there are a variety, a family of things that we're going to have to do in concert with one another, because I don't think you're going to find a silver bullet, on this, but worth debating and worth figuring out, what actually is more effective. And I think we should listen to Taiwan, which has a lot of experience in these matters, and some of the techniques that they've been using, as well as others that have faced this kind of action from China. So instead of sort of figuring it out on our own, we should do a listening campaign, and I believe we ought to have, the kind of dialogue that allows us to speak internationally about Chinese political warfare in a more regularized way with representatives from a variety of different governments. To me, that gets to both exposure of what they're doing. It also gets to best practices that people may be using that may be more effective in countering what we're talking about.
I think you mentioned, I'm over time, but I'll just say, I think you mentioned Australia has developed some interesting responses, and I'd like to learn more about that. And only with the chair's permission will I invite continued response, so I would love to hear what you have to say. Depends on.
So, Senator Merkley, first, I think we have to recognize that the United States is a federal government, 50 sovereign states that have their own law enforcement, and that you have your own localities that have resources, and that if you want to be effective in responding, it means that you're going to have to devote resources and training to state's attorney's office, district attorney's offices, right? We know that certain kinds of criminal investigations require certain kinds of expertise on the part of both prosecutors and police. A second is that we have to have a political willingness to arrest people when there are problems, right? There are all sorts of examples that you can go through where Chinese government officials have been allowed to come through the United States who have committed acts of intimidation or coercion, and they've been allowed to leave completely unscathed. Now, at the very least, we have to be careful with this because we're not going to hostage take the way that the PRC does. But I think demonstrating that we are going to follow our own rule of law and we're not going to allow these kinds of exceptions to continue is a starting point for leverage and pressure on the PRC. I think you were exactly on the right track of suggesting things that are not like for like, because we know that Beijing complains about us linking issues together like trade and human rights, but we know that they do this all the time. And if we're simply responding symmetrically, we're making it too easy for us to be predictable. We're putting us into a position where we would be saying, well, actually, we're just going to take hostages, when in fact there are other things that we should be doing. There are vulnerabilities that the PRC has, and we should be putting pressure on those places. And those issues at state government levels, right? I think it was Newsweek identified 24 state government officials in New York. The researcher who did that work is now working for Jamestown. But if you go around the country, you can find similar issues in almost every state. And unfortunately, in the state that I used to live in and that you represent, there have been issues that are there among sort of state government officials, state legislatures, because of the targeting. And I think this is that point of it's not enough to have a federal government response. It is actually something where you have to find ways, as we've done in many other criminal areas, whether it's fraud, whether it's sexual violence, that you actually have to have police and prosecutors that understand this to be accessible and to be a part of the communities that can be reported to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Merkley. I'm going to ask another round, if I can ask witnesses to be succinct. I'm going to go vote here, another round of voting, and then Chairman Smith is going to wrap this up. I'll have to leave to go vote. But I wanted to maybe just get a commitment from the three of you to, as the record's going to be open for the couple weeks after this hearing, to maybe get and I know I was reading, Admiral, your testimony, it's really, written testimony is great, but some really specific examples of Chinese actions on our soil intimidating American citizens or Taiwanese or Chinese citizens on our soil. I think Americans really need to know that. If you guys can provide an excellent, like Admiral, real quick, the police stations in New York and so what was that? That was kind of crazy.
Yeah, so those,
what the hell was that?
Senator, those were fronts to go ahead and be able to keep watch on the Chinese diaspora and be able to...
Physical buildings of Chinese communist officials in New York keeping track of American citizens?
That's right, and those...
You gotta be kidding me.
To apply pressure points on Chinese to behave, and those who maybe were considered too oppositional to be able to deal with those. So,
well, those kind of things, if we can get more specifics, if the average American knew about that, again, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter. You know, we're a free country, and we should not have the gosh darn Chinese Communist Party trying to intimidate Americans on our soil. No way. Let me give you another example. It's a bill I had with Senator Warren to give you the breadth of sense of the bipartisan nature of this. Last year, when Senator Merkley was talking about effective strategy, our bill said, hey, if there's evidence of the Chinese Communist Party trying to manipulate American elections, again, they would never stand for elections, they're going to manipulate our democracy, then we, our intel agencies, you know a lot about this, Admiral, will do everything we can to get out all the information we can, break down the Chinese firewall, which we probably can do, on how corrupt all the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party is, and let the Chinese people know about that, right? I mean, I think Xi Jinping's sister is a billionaire. How'd that happen? So let the Chinese, you want to mess with our democracy? Here you go. What do you think about that? Like, we need to go on offense here, right? I mean, these guys are coming after our democracy. If we got the goods on them, we can let people in China know just how corrupt their leaders are. What do you think about something like that? That was a bill that Senator Warren and I had, very bipartisan. You know, she and I don't necessarily represent the different wings of our parties, or we kind of do, but what do you think of something like that? A little bit of offense here.
Sir,
Why are we the punching bag?
Senator, I agree with your sentiments and all this and the passion, and I wish more people felt it and were able to be empowered to get after it. We were able to set up in the intelligence community a Foreign Malign Influence Center. It began with Russian election interference.
Yeah.
It needs
Same
to
thing.
grow and expand.
Putin's one of the richest guys in the world. Let the Russian people know that. How did he get that way? He stole it from his people. You think that would be helpful, though?
I think that center that is witting to all levels of classification and knows what we should know about what's happening should compile it. They should synthesize, they should analyze it, and they should be reporting on it. And on top of that, not just within classified circles, I believe we need to be better at selective disclosure
get it out.
of classified cases that you're talking about, and while still protecting sources and methods, which we can do. We need to get this stuff exposed.
Yeah.
So that
By the
more
way,
people are
this
aware.
wouldn't be, we made this code, this wouldn't be disinformation. We're just getting out the truth, right? If, you know, all these Chinese Communist Party leaders are all multimillionaires and billionaires, where'd they get that? They stole it from their people. Putin, he's one of the richest guys in the world. How did he get that? He stole it from his people. That's not a lie. That's not misinformation. That's just getting the facts out. I think we need to do a much better job of going on offense here, particularly when we're being attacked. Let me ask one final question. And Admiral, I'm going to ask you because you know a lot about the history. It's just astounding to me how well treated, it's kind of the Hollywood issue. Like, I try to read a lot about Chinese history. And one thing that comes back to me all the time is how Mao Zedong was somebody who, he literally was responsible for policies that killed, I don't know, you make the estimate, 50, 60, 70 million people, his own citizens, killed him. And had some of the most bizarre policies that the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, these were just unmitigated disasters. And yet you have Xi Jinping modeling everything he does on Mao Zedong. That would be like a German chancellor kind of modeling everything they do on Hitler. So how come, why do you think that never comes out? Why do you think our media, our history kind of little kid glove with Mao Zedong's legacy, right? I mean, he killed more Chinese than any other foreign power probably ever. And yet, he still lauded his portraits up in you know, in the middle of Beijing. What do you think we can do with that, if anything?
I agree that we need to highlight Chinese history and to be able to describe exactly what the long arc of the CCP has really been for the Chinese people and those mistakes that could be made again given that system, but now on a global scale.
Let me ask one other, point that you'll know a lot about. We always talk about Taiwan in terms of China's territorial aggression, but you may have seen this New York Times article, very good, recently had a very deep dive intel report from the Russian KGB or whatever they call themselves now. And it was a whole document how the Russian intel services are worried that China's going to turn to and start trying to get back land that Russia took from them in the 19th century. You know, China used to have territorial domination of the Korean Peninsula. Do you think that as the Chinese Communist Party gets stronger, that they're going to view their territorial ambitions, not just with regard to Taiwan, which we know is obvious, but with regard to Russia, where they share a huge border, with regard to Vietnam, with regard to Korea, with regard to the whole 9-dash line in the South China Sea? Who's safe in Asia if the Communist Party of China looks at its history saying, hey, we owned that once, We owned this area once. We owned part of Korea once. We owned part of Russia once. Like, where is their limiting principle? Because the Russians clearly, you know, I know we have Xi Jinping and Putin always hanging out together, but the Russian intel services are thinking, hey, we need to start protecting Russian territory because China's coming for us next. You think that helps us to get that word out, that they're so aggressive, they're going to be marching on all their neighbors, not just Taiwan here soon?
I think that China's been expanding its strategic spaces. It considers these are buffers or areas of influence that they've long held, you know, rights to be able to influence, just like we might have a Monroe Doctrine here in the United States. At the same time, if you take a look 360 degrees along every border area of China, if you go to Ladakh or Sikkim or Bhutan or Nepal or Arunachal Pradesh, it's not just the South China Sea, it's not just increased pressure in Southeast Asia or Taiwan, East China Sea. This is a full 360-degree issue.
Where they're pushing.
Where they are pushing where they can, very opportunistic here and trying to do so slowly in a creeping fashion. But this is the nature of the CCP. Expand and control to protect ultimately their regime and themselves.
Great. Thank you very much. And I appreciate, again, the witnesses. Great job, Mr. Chairman. This is great work that we're all going to be doing in a bipartisan, bicameral way. And again, if the witnesses, if you have time, if you can get us that request I made about some specifics on American soil against Americans, boy, oh boy, I think American people really would want to know about that and some of the actions we need to take. Say, hey, you're coming to mess with us? All right, we're a big country. We got our own methods to make this very painful for you. I think we need to do a little bit more on offense. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership and for an excellent hearing. Let me just ask a couple final questions before we close. You know, in March of 2024, we all recall that B. Kim, who was then Vice President-elect, had an incident where in the Czech Republic, there was an attempt to foment a car accident, which is something that happens so often here, Wei Jingxiang, so many others have had it, but in this case, it was obviously Taiwan-related. And the Czech intel community mitigated that threat. But my question, first question would be, how much coordination do we do with other countries on the threat to the diaspora and to others, especially now with Taiwan, with our allies? I remember when Liu Xiaobo got the Nobel Peace Prize, I led the effort in Congress to give 3 people in China, Chen Quanzhen, Gao Zhejiang, and Liu Xiaobo, to award them the Peace Prize. We had multiple signers. Liu Xiaobo got it, the first Chinese person ever to get it. They wouldn't allow him to go, as we all know. They kept him in prison. They wouldn't allow his wife to go. He eventually died from cancer when they wouldn't even give him assistance in terms of medical aid. But my big takeaway from talking to lawmakers who were there, and I know a lot of them in Europe, was the worry about retaliation by the Chinese Communist Party for having awarded him that very prestigious award. I was kind of shocked. It's like, you know, we should be lauding him and saying, here's the model for China. He wanted slow reform. He was part of the Charter 08 effort, as we all remember. Just a tremendous man. And yet there was almost like an apologetic view being taken, well, you know, we got to contain this, otherwise we have an economic downside. And I heard it from a lot of my colleagues, because I have chaired the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly for decades. I'm now the special rep for trafficking, but I heard it, so I had friends there, and they told me that. You know, I won't name names, it was off the record, but it was like a consistent concern. In other words, Chinese Communist Party is doing a good job in intimidating even governments instead of all standing firm against them. So how well do we coordinate with them? Is there a country or countries that you would put at the top, the UK, for example, or others, that are doing a good job in standing with Taiwan? I know we are, but I don't think we do enough either, no matter who's in the White House, but we need to do more. Secondly, what role, in your views, does higher education play on human rights and democracy in Taiwan here in this country? I had a series of hearings on Confucius Centers. I had the chancellor of NYU come and testify at one of my hearings and took him to task. Very nice guy, very civil. I even invited myself, and he accommodated that, to go to the Beijing campus of NYU to give a human rights speech, and I did it, and he was very good to allow that to happen. But I said, when they buy your entire campus, and they kind of pick who comes and gets the imprimatur of a prestigious organization like NYU, how does that affect your teaching? Can anyone talk about the Dalai Lama here? Can anybody talk about human rights abuse? Can anybody talk about Taiwan? So my question is, how well or poorly are our universities doing? And Confucius Centers, in my opinion, were one of the worst things, soft power, Chinese Communist Party, and I had so many hearings on it. Couldn't believe it. And there were hearings over here on the Senate side as well, which were great. And it was all to say, stop it. They're watching the diaspora. They're delivering a message that is pre-cooked in Beijing as to what they should say. And they're also keeping a sharp eye on the diaspora students, or the students that are visiting here. So I just, how well are they doing? And on the international side, are we coordinating with these other nations, State Department? The former chairman here was Marco Rubio. Nobody knows China like he does. So I'm sure he's got a lot on his plate lately, but it would be a great thing for us to better coordinate, if we're not already, with our allies. Peter.
So, the U.S. government can speak for itself in many respects. So what I would highlight are a couple of useful features about this. The first is the legislative discussions, the interparliamentary conversations, right? And it got a sort of a kick up with the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, founded in June 2020, right? And that's brought together dozens of countries, dozens of legislatures and an expert network associated with it to bring information and briefings, right, to now, I think it's roughly 40 countries, give or take, right? And so that's one way in which you have democracy sharing. The summit for IPAC last year was hosted in Taiwan, in Taipei. I believe one of the staff directors was there at that event. And I would point out that as you yourself chaired a hearing on this with CECC in December 2017, one of the very, very first to draw attention to these issues, right? So this parliamentary piece of it is key, and it is really the democratic countries around the world, and it's not just European, it's not just North America, but you have them in Asia, and Africa, Latin America, where you find people trying to step up and share. The second is that in the NGO network that was there of researchers, of analysts, this, I can tell you from my own experience that 12, 13 years ago, there were about 5 of us worldwide. That's not what it looks like today, right? There are dozens. How do we know about the overseas police stations in New York, in Texas, some of the other places where these centers were? Because of a European NGO that chose to research and dig into this, right? And we're all friends, we all talk, and it's gone from, just a handful to, a workshop to you can't fit them all, even in, say, the Canon, Speaker Pelosi hearing room. And if you're going to pick out some specific countries that have really been above and beyond what's there, I think one of the first ones is Czech Republic. It's simply because they have an intellectual tradition of understanding communism, and they haven't forgotten, and they have an intuitive grasp of what this is, of what these problems are, and they've sort of naturally built connections with Taiwan that said, this is important, we understand this. I think Lithuania in the Baltics is another one that has recognized the value that's there. Some of the other NATO countries on the eastern flank have found it useful, for example, to talk with the Taiwanese about runway repair, because there's an issue there. But I don't think you have a really strong tier of a lot of countries that have really pushed really hard. And it goes kind of in line with different governments. Australia has played a critical role in terms of both its government and its civil society in bringing awareness and sharing these issues. But again, I think governments have been a little more inconsistent. But you've seen this body of researchers, this body of journalists that are now prepared to report on and discuss this in a way that just wasn't possible, even when you held that first hearing in 2017.
Just a quick response to your question about the role of higher education. I think in terms of university responses, right, you can separate it between the response of the administration versus responses of sort of faculty. And, I know my colleagues in the China field who are aware of these issues of transnational repression and sort of the complexities and the implications of freedom of speech. I think individually, faculty have, attempted to address these issues and create a safe space for Chinese students on campus and to sort of ensure that there is still academic freedom around Taiwan and Xinjiang and other issues. I think in many university administrations in the United States and elsewhere, right, there is sort of a lot of financial concern due to reliance on Chinese students for revenue or sort of getting donations and sort of research institutes funded by donors with links to the CCP. And I think that has sort of impaired a more systematic knowledge sharing, coordination, and to sort of address these issues of academic freedom, freedom of speech, and transnational repression on campuses. So I think there definitely needs to be more done at the administration level to address these issues.
Sorry, I agree with my fellow panelists. I think they covered both of those topics well.
Okay. And again, I think we need to do more to, just like we try to hold our corporate America to account, and this commission has done yeoman's work on that, to continue the work with the academics. I'll never forget in my first term here, 1982, a man broke a story who was going for his doctorate at Stanford, and he broke the news about the one-child per couple policy and the heavy reliance on forced abortion to achieve it. And a couple years later, I offered amendments on the floor that passed to defund those organizations that were enabling that. He lost his Stanford credentials. And matter of fact, the Wall Street Journal did a piece called "Stanford Morality," and got behind this researcher who broke that story. 60 Minutes did a piece on it. Nova did a piece on it, and Stanford didn't see clear. They said, "Oh, you're going to hurt our access." So we need to continue, I think, that positive pressure on our higher education, and that was 40 plus years ago, and unfortunately, I think it continues to this day. But I thank you very much, all of you, for your testimonies, for your leadership, and I do ask unanimous consent that the record be kept open for 7 business days to allow members to submit additional written questions for the witnesses and for the witnesses to revise and extend their remarks. No objections, so ordered. I want to thank all of today's witnesses for your time and, above all, for your wisdom. Hearing's adjourned.